We're up to Daf Mem Hamid Beis, B'mezid lo hurza. And it seems that whenever it says B'mezid lo, it only refers to a rabbinic halacha, a drabanan, because if there is ritzui through the tzitz, in the case of shogeg, which we saw in Amid Aleph, that b'shogeg hurza, even though the dam became tamei, but the Kohen wasn't aware of it, and he went ahead and he threw the dam on the mizbeach, and the carbon has ritzui, then b'mezid, it's some sort of rabbinic psul. Now, to be honest with you, I can't figure this out. How could the rabbis passel a carbon that the Torah recognizes? Does it mean he's going to bring a replacement carbon? It can't mean that. That's impossible. No way, no how, because that would be chulin lazara, because he was yotze with the first carbon through the tzitz. So I have a feeling here when it says b'mezid lo hurza, what it really means is that we can't eat the basar. And that's what I think Rashi says over here. We can't eat the basar. But again, he's not going to bring a replacement carbon. That's impossible. Anyway, the power of the tzitz regarding a carbon tzibur is even greater and more extensive than with regard vis-a-vis a carbon yachid, such that now, even though the Kohen knew very well that the dam is tamei, but it was a carbon tzibur and he threw it on the mizbeach, then, despite the fact that he was deliberate about it, he shouldn't have done such a thing. We'll probably have to give him lashes, but nevertheless, the carbon tzibur is kosher, and that's with regard to a carbon tzibur. There's no such thing as ritzui tzitz with regard to a carbon of a guy. And this again is a pattern that we're seeing over and over again, which we saw very extensively on Amid Aleph, that the carbon of a guy is not the same as the carbon of a Jew. Now again, I don't know if this is halacha in tzitz or this halacha in the carbon, but either way, the bottom line is that if there was a zrikas dam, that the Kohen, whether deliberately or inadvertently, threw dam tamei onto the mizbeach of a carbon of a guy, there's no ritzui at all. The carbon is possible. Of course, there's no tzitz. Amru Rabbanu L'Kami Rav Papa. Now, here's the issue. If you recall, Reb Shimon said he was of the opinion that a carbon of a guy is a whole different entity with different dinim. For example, pigul, nosar, tummy, they don't apply to the carbon of a guy according to Reb Shimon. But Reb Yossi was of the opinion that the same chumras and the same psulim and isurim that apply to a carbon of a Jew apply to a carbon of a guy. So what are we going to say according to Rabbi Yossi if we elevate the status of a carbon of a guy to an equal status to that of a carbon of a Jew? What happens with ritzui tzitz in the case where the Kohen went ahead and was zorek dam tamei of a carbon of a guy? Amru L'Kami this keman delo Rabbi Yossi dik Rabbi Yossi ha'omar b'kulam ani roeh lahachmir. So he wants to say that apparently the halacha of tzitz, to exclude it from operating, to be machshir a carbon where the dam was tamei, in the case of a guy, that's halacha not in the tzitz, but it's halacha in the carbon. So that makes sense according to Reb Shimon, who says that the carbon of a guy is a different carbon. But if I'm going to say that this halacha in tzitz, that the tzitz doesn't have the power vis-a-vis the carbon of a guy, then even Rabbi Yossi could agree that the guy is going to have to bring a replacement carbon because he voluntarily took upon himself to bring a carbon, and now the dam was nizrak betuma. So the Gemara says, Amalu Rav Papa, afilu teim Rabbi Yossi shiny hasam ti amar kra lahem v'lo li'ovei kochavim. Okay, so now we want to see the pasuk lahem, and this pasuk is in Shmos. Shmos Perik Chav Ches. It says Vayel Metzach Aaron HaKohen. So we're talking about the tzitz, and it says V'nosa Aaron es Avon HaKodshim Asher Yakdishu Bnei Yisrael L'chol Matnos Kodsheim Vayel Mitzchot Tomid L'Rotzon Lahem Lifnei Hashem. And lahem is an extra word that's coming to exclude akum. So when the Torah is chiseling out the scope and the power of tzitz, it says lahem. So therefore, even Rabbi Yossi, although he elevates the korban of a guy to an identical status of a korban of a Jew with regard to pigul, nosar, tameh, etc., and with regard to Me'ilah and Tmura, but nevertheless, the limitations that the Torah places with regard to the power of the tzitz apply to a korban of a god. And it comes out now that even Rabbi Yossi has to concede that in certain contexts, the korban of a guy is different than the korban of a Jew. Amalei Rav Huna, Breder of Nosan Rav Papa. So right, it was Rav Papa who said that even Rav Yossi would concede that if the dam was nizrak on a korban of a guy, betuma, then it's not, even Rav Yossi would agree it's not a valid korban. Elameata, if we go with your logic, asher heim makdishim, okay, now we have to see the pasuk. It says, okay, this is Vayikra Chav Beis. I think we had this pasuk before, but let's see it again. Daber bnei Yisrael Aaron velbana v'nozru v'kodshi bnei Yisrael. This is about a tomei. V'lo yichalu Hashem kodshi asher heim makdishim. Asher heim makdishim. You see the word heim? And that's the exact word that we had before to darshan lahem v'lo liyakum. So hachanami heim v'lo ovdei kachavim. That if a guy brings a korban, then a tummy is allowed to eat the basar because it says asher heim mak. And we said that according to Rabbi Yossi, tameh applies to both a korban of Yisrael and a korban of akum. So if a tameh would eat the korban of an akum, according to Rabbi Yossi, he's violating an iser chamor, a very serious iser. And yet it says ham. El Omer of Ashi, Omer Kro L'Rotzon Lahem. Now the Torah, in the word Lahem, we're going to put the emphasis on the word L'Rotzon. L'Rotzon means Ritzui. And the Torah is now telling me that the tzitz, which is Meratzeh, for Tumah, but Ritzui doesn't apply to a guy. All right, there's a lot of Torah here on what we're learning, but we just, we got to get through the daf. And now we're up to the Mishnah on daf mem heyomid beis. See, I have a feeling, I'll just say this and we'll go on, that Rav Ashi is shifting back to our original perspective that the problem of the tzitz being meratzeh on a korban of tumah with regard to a korban of a guy is halacha in the korban itself. And the proof of the pudding is because l'ratzon reflects on the korban, the ritzui power inherent in the korban. It's not a reflection on the tzitz. If it was a reflection on the tzitz, then even Rabbi Yossi, as Rabbi Papa points out, would be modeh that the tzitz is limited and it cannot be mechaper for and it cannot be maratza for a carbon tum of a guy because it says lahem v'lo liakum. But now Rav Ashi is coming along and he's saying we can't go with that drush of lahem v'lo liakum, but rather we have to go with the drush of l'rotza lahem, and ritzui is not shayach by a guy. And now we're talking about the carbon itself, inherent in the carbon. Okay, anyway, the Mishnah says the following. Dvarim she'ein chayav l'lem mishum pigul. Right, we spoke at great length in the Mishnah back when, not long ago, that there's a matir and a nitar, and we only applied pigul with an iser karis bachiloso if it's a nitar, but if it's only a matir, then there's no pigul. Is chayavin aleh mishum nosar umishum tama. In other words, even though there's no pigul, let's say, for example, the komets, we said that there was no pigul on the komets because the komets is a matir and not a nitar, but nevertheless, if the komets becomes nosar, and instead of bringing it on the mizbeach today, he waits till tomorrow, then the iser nosar, with all the chumras involved, will apply. And so too, if it becomes tameh, chutz min adam. Okay, we don't understand why dam is the exception to this rule. Dam is also something that has the status of a matir, but it's not a nitar, and therefore it's not subject to the law of kares with regard to pigul. And now we're saying that there's no chiyuv nosar or tameh with regard to the dam. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Machayev b'dover shedarkon lechol. So Rabbi Shimon says if something is normally eaten, then you'll be chayev for nosar and tameh. But I think he's saying that dam is not normally eaten. Rabbi Shimon maintains that the penalties are incurred only for eating edible sacrificial matter, substances that are normally eaten, such as komets, mincha. But I guess nobody eats dam. We're not allowed to eat dam. Avola eitzim valavona vaktores ein chayov mishum tuma. Now, I understand eitzim and ketores. Nobody eats incense. Nobody eats wood. But what about lavona? Lavona is a spice. I guess you don't eat the lavona by itself, meaning in and of itself it's not edible. And therefore, according to Reb Shimon, there's no chiyuv. Now, I don't know why he only mentions tum over here, but apparently that's going to be tomorrow's daf. He says here the Mishnah doesn't explicitly state Reb Shimon's opinion regarding nosar. It only says tuma. And he says the rule is going to be extended to nosar on the basis of Gzeir Shava, linking nosar to tuma. And then we go back to our drawing board, nosar to tuma. That I did write down. So just to summarize, there's machlokas tanoim here about whether or not the halacha of nosar and tuma, which are equated to each other, would apply in the case of something that's not edible. So the Tanakama holds chayovin alem mishum nosar mishum tuma straight across the board. Again, dam is the exception, but even those things which are ein darkon lechel. And Rav Shimon says, no, you're only going to be chayav for nosar and tuma if it's a davar shedarkol lechel. And then he gives a list of that which is not darkol lechel, and therefore ein chayovin alem mishum tuma, according to Rav Shimon. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a brayso, yachol lo yechayavim mishum tuma el al davar sheish lo matirim bein le'adam bein le'mizbeach. I might think logically that if you have something that's only a matir, but it's not a nitar, then it would be excluded from tuma. Vidinu, and it's logical. Ma pigul. Right? We said that there's no pigul in the case of a dover hamatir that's not a dover anitar. Shehu b'kviyah, right? Kfiyah means that you have a chatos, and then you have a machshav of chutz zmanu, yechai b'shum pigul. Ubiyidia achas. Okay, all this become clearer when we, and v'lahuta mechlolo, when we see the contrast. Okay, let's see the contrast. Ein chayav no love. I'm sorry, I missed a word here. Oh, but now we're going to compare tuma to pigul, and in the case of tuma, we're going to have a lot of kulos, so to speak. I don't mean kulos, but what I mean is that limitations on the iser. And ein chayav dover sheishlo matirin, beinli adam beinli mizbeach. Oh, I'm sorry, that's still pigul. But tuma, now we go through tuma, we contrast it to pigul. Shehi bi olav yored. First of all, we never found that with regard to a korban chatos, you bring it olav yored, meaning if you're financially strapped, you don't even bring an animal, you bring some flour and whatever. But with regard to tuma, so let's say a tameh inadvertently ate kodshim, then he gets the opportunity, if he's not financially solid, that he'll bring, like a korban, a shnei b'nei yonah, instead of an animal. Ubishtei yedios. He has to know at one point in time that he was tameh. Then he forgot he was tameh, went ahead and eat kodshim, and now he reminds himself that he's tameh. And not only that, but hutra mechlala. Right? We have the tzitz, that's maratza on a korban that was brought b'tumah. So with regard to tumah, we have all these kulos. So if the Torah was making, and it said that if it's a dover amatir, which is not a dover anita, there's no pigul, then how much more so there's no tumah. Eno din she'enu chayvel, a dover she'esh lo matirin, only if it's a nitar, bein li odom u bein li mizbech, tamud lomar. So this is all the dinhu in the Havamina to explain why we need to derive that tuma applies even to that which is a matir and not a nitar. Asher heim makdishim li. And this is a ribui. And this ribui of asher heim makdishim li, which is in Vayikra Lamed Chaf Beis, it says Vi Nozru V'Kodshe B'nei. So that's the Parsha Tuma. Asher Hey Makdishim Li. So apparently Asher Hey Makdishim Li is a ribui to include all karbanos, and therefore all karbanos, even if it doesn't have a status of a nitar and it's only a matir, nevertheless the prohibition of tuma applies. Yochol miyad Talmud Lomar Yikra. Okay. Now, what does Yochel Miyad mean? Asher Heim Makdishim Li. Oh, Asher Heim Makdishim Li means the Maisa Hegdesh. So I might think that all the Surim of Tuma will apply in something that has the status of a matir, but it's not a nitar, even at the early stage when he was magdashit. Talmud Lomer Yikrav. Yikrav means not when he was magdashit, but rather when he brought it as a korban. And it says, Emor aleim l'doros sechem, kol ish asher yikrav mikol zar achem es el hakodshim asher yakdishu b'nei Yisrael Hashem v'tumas ol v'nichus ha'nefesh hahi. Right? So it says asher yikrav, and therefore the tameh who eats kodshim, it means after the kodshim were already brought for the avodah, then if let's say, for example, you have meat that was nitar through the zrikas adam, and now a tummy comes along and eats that meat, he's chayav. And the Torah says he gets kares. But that would not apply before the matir was chal. So it's interesting. It's kind of an inverse relationship. When the matir is chal, allowing the eating of the basar, at that point, if a tamei would eat the basar, he's chayav kares, but not before that. Omar Rabbi Lazar, v'chi yeshno gea shehu chayav. Right. So what's Rabbi Lazar's problem here? We based ourselves on the pasuk ki yikra. Okay, so now again, we've got two categories. There's something which is a nitar, and there's something which is a matir. It doesn't have the status of a nitar. So says Rabbi Lazar, does the word ki yikrav mean negia? Forget about eating the basar. Once the tamei touches the basar, is that enough to say that he violated ki yikrav and therefore he's chayav kares? That's not so. He's only chayav kares if after the zrikas adam he's tamei and he eats the basar, but not simply that he touches the basar. Yikrav. So why did the Torah use that term yikrav, which sounds like even negia would be enough to generate a chayav kares? Behuchshar basal ikar v'kosim medaber. HaKetzad mishiyikru matirin. After the dam was nizrak al gabi mizbeach, and it was matir the basar, then and only then would it be ki yikrav and the tummy richav kares. Ein lo matirin. What about something that in and of itself is not a nitar, it's only a matir? Mishiyikdash kli. Once it was received in a kli shares, so you have, shall I say, shlav bet. I mean, you have stage number 2. You had stage number 1, you were magdish. Now stage number 2, you received it in a kli shares. So kometz levona, ktores, mincha, and the sachim, they have the status of a matir, but not a nitar. How did they become royal mizbeach? By accepting them, receiving them in a kli shares. Once they received in a kli shares, if a tamei would eat them, he's chayav kares. Ashkran tuma. So we now have a source for the halacha that you're not allowed to eat the kodshim betuma, nosar minol. And how do we know that nosar will apply even in the case of something that's only a matir but not a nitar, like komets, etc.? Asi, we come back with another exercise of a chilul mituma, which we had already. V'leilef avon of mipigul. Now, why do you prefer to compare nosar to tuma? Why not prepare nosar to pigul? And I'll give you 3 common denominators between nosar and pigul. And that would give us the conclusion that a matir that's not a nitar would not be subject to nosar, just like it's not subject to pigul. And Mr. Amar, I'll prove it to you. Mituma havi le'lemelaf. Where is the similarity between whatchamacallit, between nosar and tuma, and that's called gezel. What is gezel? Gimel zayin lamed. Mipigol havi le'mesar. Number 1. No. I'm sorry. Right. So tuma should be one second. The equation between nosar should be to tuma. Why? Because of gezel. Right, the three similarities of gezel. Right, let's just quickly. The gimel is guf, and nosar and tuma are both guf became either nosar or tameh, as opposed to pigul, which is only machshava. Number two, zayin, which is zrikas adam. Nosar and tuma are only generated after the avod of zrika was done. Pigul, it's irrelevant, even in shchita would be enough. And lamed is chil. Both nosar and truma are called chil. So the Gemara says, I don't get it. You want to compare nosar to tuma? Adarab, I mean, pigul have a little bit. I'm going to give you 5 comparisons and similarities between nosar and pigul, and that would lead me to the opposite conclusion that there is no nosar with regard to a matir that's not a nitar. What are the 5? Number 1, shekain hutar. Just one second. What do you mean hutar? Okay, so again, we're trying to establish the right. So now we're saying that tuma is subject to tzitz, whereas pigul and nosar never have. Once it's pigul and nosar, that's it. It's always asa for the rest of its life. Nothing can change. Tzitz can have a bearing on tuma, but not on pigul and nosar. Tahar, right? If we're talking about pigul and nosar, we're talking about they're both tahar. Bisman, right? What is pigul? Pigul is machshav chutz zmanu. What's nosar? Nosar was it passed its allotted time. Karev, right? They're both referring to korbanos that became pasul. Is hani nefisha. Now we have 5 characteristics that are common to both nosar and pigul. Why do you then compare through chil? Why do you compare nosar to tuma? Therefore, we have to come up with an alternative. Tani Levi, minayin sha'af b'psul zman ha'kosim medaber, Talmud lom v'lo yichalu as kodshei b'nei Yisrael, shem kodshei asher makdishim li. So the brisa that was taught by Levi is going to teach me that the chiv kares of a tameh who eats kodshim comes under lo yechalu es kodshi. And here we finish up on daf. Memvav ki b'shnei chiluim hakosim medaber echad psul nosar v'echad psul tuma. Now, where's the shnei? Where does he see the word shnei? And the answer is, it says lo yechalalu with 2 lamets. It could have said lo yechalu with 1 lamet. So the extra lamet is coming to tell you that there are 2 chilulim. One is tuma, meaning if a tameh eats something that is, kodesh l'mizbeach, and he's tameh. And number 2, nosar. Nosar likewise is a chilul in the sense that it becomes mechulal for the mizbeach. It can no longer be valid for the mizbeach. So what we got up to is chutz min adam. And I believe that we get together tomorrow at noon. Is that so? Yeah. Okay. I just hope,
Did you